The day after my grandmother's funeral, I drove to the house she'd left me. My key didn't work.
Confused, I knocked.
My father opened the door, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "This isn't your house anymore." I reminded him that Grandma's will had left everything to me. He laughed. Then my mother stepped beside him and smiled. "You're just doing what family does," she said before closing the door in my face. I stood there for exactly 10 seconds. Then I pulled out my phone and made one call. Because Grandma had warned me this would happen, and she'd already made sure they couldn't get away with it. People like to believe families fall apart after one terrible argument. Mine didn't. It happened one quiet compromise at a time. By the time my grandmother passed away, my parents barely remembered where she kept the coffee mugs in her own kitchen. I did. For nearly 8 years, every Saturday belonged to Grandma. I'd stop by before sunrise with a toolbox in one hand and breakfast in the other. Sometimes I repaired loose deck boards. Sometimes I cleaned gutters or changed light fixtures. Other weekends, I simply sat beside her on the porch while she told stories about growing up in Michigan, long before smartphones and social media made everyone too busy to visit the people who loved them. She always insisted on paying me. I always refused. Instead, she'd laugh and sneak $20 bills into my jacket pocket anyway. My parents thought I was wasting my weekends. "You could be working overtime," my father used to say. "Or enjoying your life," my mother added. I never argued, because sitting with Grandma wasn't a chore. It was the best part of my week. After Grandpa died, the lake house became quieter. Too quiet. The place needed laughter, conversation, and someone willing to replace burned-out light bulbs without being asked. My parents only visited when there was something they wanted. A birthday dinner, Christmas photographs, or another conversation that somehow drifted toward the value of the property. Grandma noticed everything, even when she pretended not to. One afternoon, while we watched the sun disappear across the lake, she looked at me and smiled. "People don't change after someone dies," she said softly. "They simply stop pretending." At the time, I thought she was talking about grief. Now I know she wasn't. She passed away peacefully 3 months later. The funeral was beautiful. Neighbors shared stories I'd never heard. Former students hugged me and told me how she'd changed their lives during her years as an elementary school teacher. My parents cried harder than anyone else, at least until the service ended. Then the conversations quietly shifted. "What do you think the house is worth now?" "Lakefront prices have gone crazy. We'll have to decide what to do with it." Every sentence sounded less like mourning and more like negotiation. A week later, the family gathered at the attorney's office. The will was short. Grandma left small gifts to charities she loved, family heirlooms to different relatives, and then the attorney paused before reading the final page. "The residence located on Willow Lake, including all contents and property, shall pass solely to my grandson." Silence. My mother's smile disappeared first. My father's jaw tightened so hard I thought I heard his teeth grind. Then, almost magically, both smiled again. They hugged me, congratulated me, called it exactly what Grandma wanted. Anyone watching would have believed they were genuinely happy. I almost believed it myself. 3 days later, I drove to the lake house carrying flowers I'd planned to place beside Grandma's favorite chair. The key wouldn't fit. There was a brand new deadbolt on the front door. Through the window, I saw my parents moving boxes into the living room. My father opened the door just enough to block the entrance. "You don't need to make this difficult," he said calmly. I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He folded his arms. "This house belongs to the family now." "It belongs to me," I answered quietly. My mother stepped beside him. "Oh, sweetheart," she said with a pitying smile. "You were just doing what family does." Then my father slowly closed the door. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten them. I simply walked back to my truck. Because they thought they'd stolen Grandma's house. What they didn't know was that Grandma had already planned for this exact moment. I didn't drive home. Instead, I pulled into the same overlook where Grandma and I used to watch the sunset over Willow Lake. For nearly an hour, I sat there staring at the water, replaying my father's words. "You were just doing what family does." Funny. For years, Family meant I fixed Grandma's leaking roof while my parents vacationed in Florida. Family meant I drove her to every doctor's appointment because they were always too busy. Now, suddenly, family meant surrendering the one thing she'd intentionally left me. I almost laughed. Then I remembered something. About 6 months before Grandma passed away, she'd handed me a plain white envelope. She'd been unusually serious. "Promise me you won't open this unless someone challenges my wishes after I'm gone." I'd promised without asking why. Until that moment, I'd completely forgotten about it. The envelope was still inside the fireproof lockbox in my apartment. I drove there immediately. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line made my stomach tighten. "My dear, if you're reading this, then exactly what I feared has happened." I kept reading. Grandma wrote that she'd spent years watching her own children become more interested in her house than in her happiness. She said they rarely visited unless they needed money or wanted to convince her to sell. She also admitted something that stunned me. She hadn't trusted them for a very long time. Near the bottom of the letter, she'd written one final instruction. "Go to the basement. Behind the old bookshelf is a wall safe. The combination is your birthday. Everything you need is inside." The next morning, I drove back to the lake house before sunrise. My parents' SUV was gone. They were probably buying new furniture for a house they believed was already theirs. The spare basement entrance still used the original key. Grandma had never changed that lock. Within minutes, I was standing in the unfinished basement. The enormous oak bookshelf looked exactly as I remembered. It took every bit of strength I had to slide it away from the wall. Behind it was a small steel safe covered in dust. I entered my birthday. The lock clicked. Inside sat several neatly labeled folders, a flash drive, and another letter. I opened the folders one by one. Property records, bank statements, insurance policies. Then I found Grandma's journals. Page after page described conversations she'd never shared with me. My parents had repeatedly pressured her to sell the lake house. They'd suggested she was becoming forgetful. They'd even encouraged her to move into assisted living despite multiple doctors confirming she was perfectly capable of living independently. The final folder contained something even more important: a trust agreement. Months before her death, Grandma had legally transferred ownership of the house into an irrevocable trust. The trust named only one beneficiary:
Me.
According to the documents, the house had never become part of her probate estate at all. Changing the locks hadn't made my parents homeowners. It had simply made them unauthorized occupants. I called Grandma's attorney immediately. An hour later, I sat across from him as he carefully reviewed every document. When he reached the trust papers, he leaned back, smiled quietly, and removed his glasses. "Your grandmother," he said, "was one of the most organized clients I've ever represented." He closed the folder. She anticipated every move they might make. I asked the only question that mattered. "So, what happens now?" He looked directly at me. "Tomorrow morning," he said calmly, "your parents are going to receive a phone call they never saw coming." The phone call came at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. I wasn't there to hear it, but according to my attorney, my parents answered expecting another relative. Instead, they heard a calm voice informing them that the lake house belonged to an irrevocable trust, that they had no legal ownership, and that they were required to vacate the property immediately. An hour later, my phone rang. My father's name flashed across the screen. For the first time in days, I answered. "You went behind our backs?" he snapped. "I followed Grandma's wishes," I replied. "You called lawyers over your own family?" "No," I said evenly. "Grandma called them months before she died." Silence. Then my mother came on the line. "Honey, we don't have to make this ugly." I looked out my apartment window. "I didn't. You know we weren't trying to steal anything." I almost reminded her about the changed locks, the moving boxes, the new deadbolt. Instead, I simply asked one question. If Grandma wanted you to have the house, why didn't she leave it to you? Neither of them answered. 3 days later, the court issued its order. The trust documents were unquestionable. Ownership had legally transferred months before Grandma passed away. My parents had no claim. By Friday morning, A sheriff's deputy supervised the turnover of the property. I stood quietly in the driveway while movers carried my parents' furniture back into the rental truck they'd brought. Neither of them looked at me. For the first time in my life, there was nothing left for them to argue. Facts had replaced opinions. When the truck finally disappeared down the road, I unlocked the front door with the original key. The house felt exactly the way Grandma had left it. Peaceful. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Her favorite rocking chair still faced the lake. Resting on the seat was a small envelope with my name written across the front. My attorney smiled. She asked me to leave this here after everything was settled. Inside was one final handwritten note. My dear, if you're reading this, then you stood your ground without becoming cruel. That's the only victory that matters. Never confuse love with obligation, and never let guilt convince you to surrender what someone entrusted to your care. I sat in Grandma's rocking chair until the sun slipped below the water, just as we had done so many evenings before. She hadn't really left me a house. She'd left me a lesson. The people who truly love you never demand that you sacrifice your dignity to prove your family. And in the end, Grandma protected both.